It's so great to be back here. In the last few weeks, we've been walking through the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ as we went through Easter. We'll be jumping back to 1 Samuel 18, so if you want to turn with us there today, we're going to be jumping back in where we left off and finishing up that series. But as we think about that, I was reading through this chapter and thinking about what we've been talking about, and really the idea that came to mind is just this idea of perspective. Do we have a healthy perspective on life? Do we have a healthy perspective on what God is doing, on what God has done? I think of the disciples when Jesus died. Their perspective on everything kind of fell apart. Right? Their leader was gone. The person they were following had left, and they really didn't even know what to do with themselves. Right? Some of them went back to doing what they had been doing before. Right? For the most part, they lost hope. We talked about it last week on the road to Emmaus. What did they say? We followed Jesus, who was a prophet, right? This one who was going to redeem the nation of Israel. Right? These things were past tense. They didn't even believe that they had actually happened. They didn't know how to follow through with these things. They didn't know what the future looked like. And then Jesus rose, right? He revealed himself. For 40 days he was there. And then he ascended into heaven. But you can imagine what their perspectives were when Jesus left, and then persecution started happening soon after. It would have been easy to get down on themselves, to beat themselves up, to figure out if they had to take matters into their own hand. And we're going to look at that today in the life of Saul. We're on the heels of this David and Goliath battle there in 1 Samuel 17. We'll go over that story a little bit. Remember what was going on with David and Goliath. That Goliath was coming out day after day as the Philistines and the Israelites were facing off against the valley, and Goliath would come out and he would shout these insults against the people, against the nation of Israel, against their God, and they really just sit there and shook in their armor, shook in their boots, and they didn't want to come out and fight because they didn't want to become slaves, to be defeated by this giant. And then in the midst of all of this going on, this unenlisted man, this youth, David, comes up. And he says, I'm not going to stand for somebody insulting Israel, and my God, I'm going to go out and fight. Saul says, who is this? And he doesn't know who he is. We're going to find a little bit more in our story today that 1 Samuel doesn't really walk through everything in the exact timeline, right? We think of David showing up long before this time and playing the harp for Saul, but that's really the narrative in which it's written. And so really Saul's first understanding of David is more than likely going to be right at that point in battle, at which point he's invited into be part of the kingdom, and then he's enlisted to be the man who plays this harp, this lyre for the king. But in the middle of all this, he defeats Goliath, throws the stone. He says, right, I'm coming in the name of the Lord to fight you, to fight this battle, and he wins. The Philistines shake and they start running away, and Israel lets out a battle cry, and they chase after him as far as Gath and really defeat them and push them back. The people are safe. The battle is victorious. They have won. So Saul should be happy, right? We're probably going to see this a little bit different today than what we should expect the outcome to be. We'll be looking at his life, and we'll be looking at our own lives and how perspective can make all the difference. And it is going to for Saul here today. The definition I found for perspective was a state of one's own ideas, or facts as they see it. And I thought that was a very poignant way to put that. Perspectives are the facts as you or I see them. Facts are objective, but perspective is subjective. And so we look and we see what's going on. We have a saying we've heard so much. I think I've heard it more in recent years over and over and over and again. It's this idea that perceived reality is reality. And the more I thought on that statement this week, the more I realized, no, it's not. Right? It may be someone else's reality, but it's not actually reality. The perception of life that we choose to take doesn't necessarily mean that's the fact of life. It's just a fact of life that we've chosen to assume it to be. We're going to see in Saul that he's going to pick out points in the story. He's going to pick out different aspects and different behaviors and different events that he's going to choose to rule his life, to reign over him, to influence his decisions and his behaviors. But what we're going to see is that They're his perception on these events. They're his own take based on his own circumstances, his own insecurities, his own problems. And truthfully, it's not even the reality of what's going on, but it's what he chooses to see. When I started thinking of this idea of this perceived reality, what came to mind is this idea of magic, right? You might turn on TV and there might be one of those magic shows. You might flip to another channel, it might be one of the shows that reveals all the magic that's going on behind the scene. If you're like me, I always like to know the mechanics of all those types of things. Maybe I'm weird, I just like the details and those types of things. But I had a friend in college, and he loved doing magic, and he was very talented at it. I use the term magic loosely. And he would start out every performance that he did by saying, "This is not magic. What I'm doing is not magic. This is simply sleight of hand. But what you're seeing and what's going on in your mind is your mind's perception of what is happening. It's not truth, right? If I'm taking this ball and putting it in this hand and closing it and saying how many are in here, and I open it and nothing's there, it's not that those balls were ever there. You perceive that they were placed in the hand and that somehow they actually disappeared." And he would go into great details to explain these things. He said, "It's not my hands that are doing magic, it's just sleight of hand. It's your mind playing tricks on itself." And as I read through 1 Samuel 18 this week, I saw that in the life of Saul. That his mind was playing tricks on him, on how he saw the things going on around him. Even though the events he was looking at were true, they weren't in light of how God was using these circumstances. I'm going to read for you, starting in Samuel 18, 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. It said, "As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. This was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." We'll get back to Jonathan really handing over his ability or his position as the heir to the throne a little bit later. But we see everything that's going on there, right? Saul brings him in. He doesn't let him go home. He says, "I want you to be part of this," right? Samuel, through God, kind of mentioned this earlier when he was talking to the people of Israel, that he's going to take your young men, right? He's going to take your warriors and claim your sons as his own. That's what we see going on in this moment, just as Samuel had expected to happen. In the midst of all this, it says he places him over the men of war, right? He puts him in charge. He becomes a military leader. So this is what we see happening so far in these verses, that Jonathan's soul was knit to David. Saul took him and would not let him return home. Jonathan gave him a position as heir. Saul set him over the men of war, became a military leader. His position was pleasing to all the people. And we're going to see they even sing as he is coming home in just a few minutes. You see all of that going on. That would be reasons for Saul to rejoice, reasons for Saul to be excited, right? That's what he wanted. How do you raise up military leaders? How do you gain political assets, which is what David could have been used for? How do you see the benefit of this young man who has just defeated this giant so that the entire army can defeat the Philistines and that you as the king can be seen as victorious? But Saul doesn't see it that way. Saul had a way that he wanted everything to work out in his mind. He wanted to be seen a specific way, and it just wasn't happening. Sometimes this happens in our own lives. We have goals, we have purposes, we have things we want to happen, and sometimes they happen, and when they do, we say, "That's not really how I wanted this to happen," right? That's not really how I wanted all of this to come together, and we lose the correct perspective. And the perspective we gain is something that's not good. So what happens when we lose perspective? When we lose perspective, we lose clarity of the situation. When we lose perspective of what's going on, we lose clarity of the situation that's happening right in front of our eyes. It's because we choose to see it in a different manner. We choose to see it in a different light, a light that's not reflective of what's actually going on. We'll pick back up reading in verse 6. It says, "And as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet who? To meet King Saul." Not warrior David, right? They came out to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs of joy and musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. "Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s." Now, as we read that, we think, man, this is an absolutely just raking insult to the king, saying that he's 1/10 the man that David is. But truthfully, that's not actually what's going on. You see, Hebrew poetry doesn't really work that way. In Hebrew poetry, he's saying Saul and David together have killed thousands and 10,000s. They're not attributing these things to just one man. They're attributing it to the army. But what happens when these thoughts creep in our head? This fear that someone else can replace us, can remove us, can be who we've always supposed to be. You start seeing these things differently. You understand, in those days, you couldn't just come out on the streets and insult the king. That generally didn't go well for you. Saul's already proved himself not to be a stable man, so this is not an opportunity you're going to take to insult him. It's not what's going on, but it is the words that he's hearing whispered in his ear, these words that are being said. Have you ever been in a place like that before? You hear somebody talking and they're saying things and it sounds like good things, but you start to feel offended by it. You start to be put off by it. You start to think that somehow it's against you, opposing you. That's where Saul is. The battle is won. The Philistines are defeated. Israel is safe. They gained a military and political leader. Yet he's hearing these whispers in his ear that something's going wrong. One of the things that causes us to lose perspective and lose clarity of the situation is insecurity. We already know with Saul, right, that Samuel's already told him that God has lost favor with you and that you've been replaced by a neighbor that is better than you. So this idea is already in his head, right? Samuel's already told him, you've got a reason to be insecure because you've already been replaced, right? You're already going to be removed from this position. I learned the truth a long time ago, and I shared it with somebody this morning, that when you become a leader, that you're always an interim leader, because you're not always going to be the person that leads. I don't care what role you're in, what position you're in, what you're doing, you're always temporary. Saul was always going to be temporary, regardless, because his lifespan only lasted so long. But they come out singing these words. Saul his thousands and David his 10,000s. And despite his understanding to know that's not what's going on, it's what he hears anyways. As he walks back into these cities, as he sees the streets lined with people cheering him on, celebrating Israel's victory over their arch rivals, the Philistines, over something that they looked like was impossible, has now been won, he's no longer celebrating. But he's fearful. We struggle to see God's hand at work sometimes because we're looking to see God working in the wrong ways. We struggle to see him work because we want to see him when we want him to work, where we want him to work, how we want him to work. Have you ever felt that way before? Sometimes we get on the other sides of the stage in life and we look back and we think, where was God at? And then God just like takes us and grabs us by the shoulder and moves us. And we're like, oh, there was God working the whole time. I was just looking somewhere else, right? My mind and my eyes were focused in someplace else. Have you ever been there before when God shifts your focus, shifts your attention, shifts your perspective to something just slightly different than where you've been looking, to reveal that he is still there, that he is still God, that he has not left, that he is working things in your favor for your good, for your benefit. Wherever he was looking was not where God was working. We know this has already been a standard for Saul's life. Saul chooses to do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants to do it, and he wants God's recognition, but he doesn't want the idea to have to be obedient to what God calls him to do in the meantime. He's okay with partial obedience. We've already discussed that's full disobedience. He wasn't happy that Israel was victorious. He was not glad they were safe. He was not confident that God had delivered them. You know, another reason how we know we lose clarity, another way we know that we lose perspective, is when the affirmation of others become a detriment to ourselves. That when other people receiving praise becomes an insult against us. You might hear that and think, that's an odd thing to say. Have you ever been at a job before and somebody was thanks, you did a fantastic job on this project you were given. You did a fantastic job on whatever this thing was. And you heard them be praised and you thought to yourself, why wasn't I praised for that? Why didn't I get the recognition? Why didn't I get the congratulations? And we start to hear those things, see, I deserve that. What happens after that? They're doing this intentionally, right? This is a scheme against me, right? Have these things ever sung in your mind when you're in that place? It could be at work, right? It could be at church. It could be even at home with your spouse, right? We all know responsibilities at home are so much. We were talking about that this morning, that you can have all these responsibilities, but you ever get that moment you're like, is my spouse really doing the same amount of work that I am, right? Don't raise your hands, right? We're not trying to cause any problems in here. We've all been there before, right? It's this understanding that gets stuck in our mind of, I feel like I'm doing more. I feel like this is an unfair balance, right? And then this is intentional. This is a problem. I don't know why this is happening to me. What happens when those things start going on? Our focus and our perspective turns inward towards us. We start to lose sight of all those other things going on around us. All these other pieces that are at play, all these other pieces that are at work. Another thing, when we lose perspective, we give way to anger and jealousy. When we lose perspective of what God is doing and the things in our life, we give way to anger and jealousy. I'll read verses 8 through 11. After the scene, it says, and Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Right, this resentful look towards him, and watched him and did not like what was going on. It says, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre. And as he did day by day, Saul had his spear in his hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. What happened so much so that he gets this evil spirit, right? We've seen this mention of this evil spirit before. So what we don't see is in this time span, previously, when it says, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and David had success. We read it in a verse, but what we're probably looking at here is years. That God placed him in this role. We see years passing in this time, years of interactions that are going on. This harmful spirits being sent to Saul, and David's the one there playing the harp and playing the lyre and calming and soothing this evil spirit that he has within him. Until the more he watches him, it's no longer soothing anymore, and it's angering him, and it's despising him. I know that's one of those things we read in Scripture, and it's tough to reconcile, right? Why did God send an evil spirit to Saul? Right? How does God send an evil spirit? How does that make any sense? It's one of the things we look at and we have to understand what God is doing. God doesn't tempt, right? God's not sending evil, but God can use the sphere of everything that exists for the purpose of his glory, to bring things to the fruition that he wants to see done. We understand, we see this in James 1:14 says that he can use all of these things, use them for a purpose, but no man is tempted by God. He's only tempted by the desires within him. What God is not doing is he's not sending a temptation and making Saul be tempted. What he's doing is allowing this evil spirit to come in and really enlarge or really shine a light on this weakness that already exists within Saul. Shining a light on this jealousy, shining a light on this issue, shining a light on this problem. In the midst of this, Saul has the own ability to make his own decisions. Saul can choose to go along with this or to not go along with it, to continue to be tempted to surrender to God or continue in his disobedient ways, which is what caused this evil spirit in the first place. But he gives way to it. We saw when he says he's very angry and he displeased the saying. He says they've given David 10,000s and me thousands. Why don't they just give him the kingdom? We're watching this spiral in Saul's life. Right, this place from the king who was called to lead to this person who's in this role of leadership but is now fearful of everything happening around him. He's so worried, he's so caught up in the minutiae of these small details, he's probably negating the responsibilities he even has outside of this now. His perspective is causing him to lose sight of what's going on. It's so easy for us to do this. I would love to say that when we fall into this trap of losing perspective, very soon after we snap back into place and we realize, man, my eyes were just fixed on the wrong thing. So often it's not that way, is it? So often we are allowed to stay in that pit, right? To throw a pity party, to wallow around in that mire and that clay and justify it all the time. To say we're okay for doing these things. We see Saul, it's detrimental to not only his life, but to everything that's going on. We give way to these things. When we lose sight of what God is doing, or we give way to anger and jealousy. When we give way to anger and jealousy, it's really this idea that we're trying to take back control. Right? We're shouting to God, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what's going on. I've got to be in control of this. Truthfully, because what's going on is not what I would choose. I'm going to be angry at you now for it. I'm going to choose to resent my circumstances. And we don't come out and say, God, I resent you for my circumstances. What do we say? I resent the things that are going on around me. I hate that my life has turned out the way it is. I hate the things that are going on right now. More often than not, just like Saul, God's saying, I have a path that led to where you wanted to go, right? Even the things that are going on now that you don't like are trying to point you back in that direction. If you feel like you're fighting against the current, it's probably because you are. How does this happen for him? It happens in all these ways. He rages against David's success. Verse 12, we see Saul is afraid of David because the Lord was with him. It says that the Lord had departed from Saul. Verse 14 said, David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. How far does his anger and jealousy take him? He even tries to give one daughter away. It doesn't work. He tries to give him another daughter, Michal, and says, hey, I'm going to give it to her. And man, I don't know how type of daughter this was, but said she's going to be a snare to him, right? Hopefully she's going to cause him problems. And then in the midst of causing him those problems, said, hey, instead of just giving her to him like he was required to, right, by this agreement that he'd already made, that whoever killed the Philistine would get to become part of the family and marry his daughter. Instead, he says, hey, I'm going to kind of devise this way to kill him. I'm going to say he's required to bring me 100 foreskins to the Philistines, and they've got to bring them in. And surely in the effort to make this ridiculous thing come true, he's going to just die. But you see, God's got this pesky way of taking our rebellion and then just making us look foolish in the midst of that rebellion. What does he do with Saul? David says, hey, sorry it took so long. I'm going to bring you 200 instead of 100. Right? I'm going to double up what you thought, and I'm still going to survive. And David is seeking to do this and being faithful, but Saul has other intentions in mind. Have we ever noticed that when we lose perspective, we sometimes wish bad things on other people. We don't have a pure heart. And then it enrages us when the people around us do. Right? You're like, why do you have to be a goody two-shoes? Right? Why do you always have to do things the way you're supposed to? When we lose perspective, we start getting angered by those things. Because our eyes are drifting from where God wants us to be. Drifting from the things that He has for us. Drifting from the goodness that we experience in His presence. And as we drift from that presence, we lose that desire that we had in Him. We start getting drawn in by the dark. Saul's reputation was tied to his position. Everything had to do with Saul wanting to remain as king. He could not perceive threats. Right? We see this happen in the ancient world. They were always killing off people. I don't care if it was their brothers or their cousins or their infant children. Right? They did not stand for people threatening their role. And Saul seemed like he was the same way. He already tried to have Jonathan killed over something silly and something foolish if the people had not stepped in. What causes anger and jealousy to creep in? We're not seeking to be who God's called us to be when He's called us to be it. And those two things are key. Who God's called us to be and when God's called us to be that person. The hard thing about that is sometimes by the time we realize who God's called us to be, God's calling us to be somebody else and somewhere else with someone else. And that's not always an easy thing to do because normally by that time we're like, okay, God, I was really just getting my feet wet here, right? I was really just gaining momentum. I was really just doing what I wanted to do. But God's like, your preparation in this moment and this time and this season is preparing you for what I have next. He never leaves us just standing still. He never leaves us in a place. He wants us to be faithful moving forward. I thought about this, and I thought about people who tried to keep their perspectives and maintain everything the same way. And I think of former churches that I was in, and we had volunteers worked in ministries and big ministries and lots of people. And I remember I went to a group one day, and they were fantastic. They were dedicated servants. I loved them to death, and they cooked food in the kitchen. They were wonderful. Put it on a pan, put it in the oven, turned the oven on to 350, heated the food up, and they put it on plates for kids. And that was wonderful, except for they were like in their 30s and 40s. And I said, it's great that you do this. It's a wonderful entry-level position, but I need you moving out, engaging with people. You're faithful, you're here, you build relationships. And what they would normally say is, no, I just want to be here. I'm just fine standing in the wings, not really doing anything. I don't want the attention. I don't want the responsibility. I just want to kind of hide back here. And anytime we ever tried to put somebody else working in the kitchen, they eventually just ran those individuals off. It's too hard, it's too difficult, right? We can't put bagel bites on a pan, and not anybody can just turn an oven on and put it in. The perspective was tied to that position, tied to that role, tied to that responsibility. God was trying to pull them away to do something else, but they didn't want it. It's not knocking anybody that serves in the kitchen ministry. It's wonderful. It's incredible. Appreciate all the incredible food, but sometimes God calls us out of that position to step out. It's not just those positions. It's any position we can be in. Anger and jealousy come forward. Anger and jealousy cause us to lose perspective because when we become angry and we become jealous upon things, because God didn't call us there. He doesn't call us to have a heart of anger. It doesn't cause us to have a heart of jealousy. He calls us to have a heart of humility. When those things start stirring up inside of us, we know it's not God. The third reason we lose perspective. We lose perspective when we are not kingdom focused. How do you know Saul wasn't kingdom focused? He said the actual words. What more can David have but the kingdom? Let me translate that in Saul's language. What more can he have but my kingdom? That's what Saul was thinking. This is where his mind was at. This is mine to have. Right? Saul had forgotten that Samuel had blessed him, that God had ordained him to be the king, that he was placed in that position, that he didn't earn it, that he didn't do anything to put him in that role. Matter of fact, if you were even placed in that role as Saul was, you were placed there because you were incompetent and you weren't made to be the one in that role anyways. It was bad for Saul to be king, but it says, because what does God say? I'm going to put here, this is going to be the man that restrains my people. Right? You're not going to be good in this position because this position is not good for you to be in. But Saul never saw it. God would use these kings in later years, but Saul was a broken picture of what this image was supposed to be. In his mind, this was his to have, his to control who comes and who goes, who leads and who doesn't. He'd forgotten God's role in this entire situation. He'd forgotten that God was at work. In the middle of that, that's why we see this harmful spirit sent to him. It wasn't because God was picking on Saul. It was because Saul's disobedience occurred time and time again, that eventually God chooses to correct the course, to get things back where he needs it to be. We can only be disobedient for so long until God chooses to act, until he steps in and chooses to change things. He had been eyeing David from that day. One of the ways that we can see that he was not kingdom focused. I would love to say that he just lost sight that he wasn't kingdom focused, but he knew and he was aware of it. We read it earlier because it says, and David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. Do you know why Saul was in fearful awe of David in that moment? Because Saul had tasted that same success. And it was the success that you have when God is on your side. When he saw it in David, he was reminded of what that looked like. When he saw it in David, he realized that that was something that he used to have, and that the words of Samuel had to be echoing in his ears, that you have been replaced. You have lost favor with God. That idea that tasting that success again is not going to happen. To be used in that way again is not going to happen. When he sees it in David, he doesn't say, God, why have I forsaken you? Why have I ran away? Why have I been disobedient? God, I deserve this. What does he say? How can I get rid of this guy who's here to do God's work? Perspective is everything. Do we see God's hand at work in our life? Do we see him moving? Do we see him working? When we think about that harmful spirit that was sent to Saul, I just wrote a question down. I don't think about answering out loud. What way would a harmful spirit come to you? If God sent that harmful spirit, that thing to shine a light on or expose, to really kind of poke that sore spot that you have, that would reveal this sin that nags, what would it reveal? Would it reveal humility? Would it reveal leaning on God, or anger, or jealousy, insecurity, or disobedience? Would it find lacking because it found someone committed to God's work and the kingdom, to his purpose and his plan? It's not all sad today. We're going to talk about how we gain perspective, not just how we lose it. We've got 3 simple points today. We gain perspective by seeking God's plan. I would love to say that you can seek God's plan today, figure out what he wants you to do, and then just walk away, but that's not really how God works. We seek him every day. To wake up in the morning and make that our goal, to make that our purpose, to make that our drive, and we can find what he has for us and what he wants for us here and now, in this day, in this moment, in this season. What is God calling us to do when these things change with the life that we live, from the season of life that we're in, to the friends, to the people that are around us? Are we seeking God's plan? Second one I have is, are we committed to God's plan? Are we committed? Gain perspective by committing to God's plan. Are we committed to it? Jonathan saw very early on that this was God's plan. What was his response? Here's my sword, and here's my shield, and here's my armor, and Here's my belt, right? Here's everything that I have. Here's my responsibilities. Here are my roles. Here's my heirship to the throne. You can have it. It's not mine to have. Jonathan recognized that his heart was knit to David so early on in that situation. He committed. We're going to even see Michal, the wife that he's given, is going to be committed to David. That even the people around Saul, even his own family members, right, even his own children saw that this was the person that God had sent. But Saul didn't want to see it. It wasn't part of his perspective. It wasn't part of his plan. Not what he wanted to see done. Are we committed to his plan? You know what I found over the years is committing to God's plan, committing to uncertainty. Now, we know the certain part of God's plan, that he's going to work everything out for his good and for his glory. He's going to work out for the good of those who love him. We know that's going to happen. We know that in the end that Christ is going to return, that he is going to wage war. He is going to win the battle and the victory once and for all. We already know sin, death, and sin and death was defeated on the cross. Right? We already know all that. We live in uncertainty in the moment. That we don't know what tomorrow holds for us. We don't know how many more breaths we have. But we do know this, that we're called to commit to his word and his work. Commit to his plan. Right? Sometimes that's writing a blank check to God. Saying, God, you're in control. Whatever you ask from me, this is it. David was a shepherd who was delivering food to his brothers on the battlefield. He undoubtedly received the call from God to fight the giant that every single enlisted man in Israel was fearful of fighting, including Saul himself, who was head and shoulders above everyone else. David leaves his family. He's going to be part of Saul's court. He plays the harp and the lyre, even though Saul has an evil spirit, and he throws a spear at him. And at some point, he must have came back and played that harp and that lyre again, because he evaded him twice. Somehow, in the midst of this moment, he's just signing this blank check, saying, God, here is my life. I don't know your plan, but I'm just here to be a part of it. God, whatever you call, wherever you lead, are we committed? John 14:23-24 says this, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him. And we will come to him and make our home with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. Giving this clear picture in Scripture of how we're to obey God, which is obeying his commandments. To love him is to obey. Saul was disobedient, but David was something else, a man after God's own heart. Finally, the last thing that we find joy in God's plan. How do we gain perspective? That we find joy in God's plan. And as I said before, sometimes it's finding joy in uncertainty. We're uncertain about what tomorrow holds, but we are certain that God is there. We're uncertain about what the future looks like, but we know that God has these things already planned out because he can see it. He's already putting things in place for that future. Oftentimes, as our lives are, when we stop and we look back over the years, we see where he was putting all these pieces in place before we even realized what he was doing. Sometimes we experience pain and difficulty and trials and hardships. Sometimes these uncertainties that we go through are more than we ever expected. We're still called to find joy. The song earlier that played right before we departed their anthem said, you are good. You are good, you are good, you are good. I'm not going to try to sing it, you won't hear that today. But it said, you are good. I heard a truth this week. They were talking about this idea of reality and perceived reality, this idea of individual truth, that we get to make all our own rules up and those things get to be true. And what we get to rely on is that we don't get to come up with our own truth. That God's already set a standard for what's right and what's wrong. He's already set a standard for us and for the world around us. He drew this line in the sand a long, long time ago. Because at the end of the day, we can know that God is good. That if He gives us truths, these truths are good. In Himself, who He is as a good God, the only God, that when those things are good, we can trust and rely on them, even when we don't understand. Even when we don't know, even when we can't see what the future holds. Psalm 119, 15 through 16. I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word. We read this and we think about Christ, His fulfillment of the blessings that we have in Him. The author who wrote Psalms just had the law, just had the precepts. And these precepts spelled out that He was unworthy. He was unholy, that He couldn't do these things Himself. The delight was not simply in the expectations written down, but in the fulfillment of God's love from generation to generation. Our perspective, in spite of our circumstances, is not on what's going on around us, but in the God who created us. The God who has been faithful yesterday, today, and will be faithful tomorrow. That shapes who we are and who He's called us to be if we're to live in His strength. If we're to find joy in what He's called us to do. I'll pray and we'll have our invitation. Lord God, we thank You for Your love. We thank You for being good even when we are not. We thank You for being faithful even when we fall short, Lord God, and You are always faithful. Lord, allow us to gain perspective of this life, not by measuring the things around us, not by popular opinion or cultural trends, but by the goodness of who You are. The life that Your Son lived, the redemption that You offer through Him. Change our perspective, fix our eyes on You, that we may see You, that we may pursue You, Lord God, that You may reveal Yourself to us, that we may be transformed for Your good and Your glory, for the sake of all those that we come in contact with. Lord God, call us to respond today as only You can. Lord, we love You. Pray this prayer in Your name. Amen. You may stand. The song is the heart cry of what we went over today, that God, we want the Lord to be glorified in all that we do. When we see things, the way we interact with others, the way we live our life. Make that our call. We leave here today. I pray we will be dismissed. Lord God, we thank you for your love. Lord God, make this song be the cry of our hearts, the plea that flows out from us. Father, that you be glorified. Lord God, help us to find this in your word, in prayer, in communication with you. Lord God, and seeking to live out truths, the life of your Son through our own life. Lord God, be glorified. Give us the strength, the courage, and the boldness, Lord God, to live this week in this manner. Lord, we love you. We pray this prayer in your name.